All right, world history people, let's go ahead and keep learning about cultures in Africa. So, we got some African cultures here, and here we go. So, today's big topic is the transatlantic slave trade. And I'm going to kind of do my best to cover the whole thing right here, so let's do it. So, for the majority of world history, Europeans didn't really mess with Africa. Africa has some really awesome tribal warrior guys. They're experts at spears and one on one kind of man on man combat. And Europeans were just getting murdered. But once Europeans had guns, they had a whole lot more of a advantage when it came to sort of combat and to direct conflict. So the development of guns is really going to sort of change the relationship that Europeans and Africans are going to have with each other, starting in the 1500s all the way more or less to the modern day. So, yep, it's all about the guns. Okay, and so I told you guys in the Americas unit how the Europeans had gone to this new world and they gave diseases to so many of the Native Americans who lived there, and many of the Native Americans died. And the thing is, these Europeans found all these new goods that they could get out of the New World, especially stuff that required a lot of manual labor, stuff like tobacco, cotton, and these other sort of tropical goods or goods made in tropical climates. And so Europeans originally sent poor white people to the New World to work on these farms and plantations. But the problem is, those poor white people, they were dying from other diseases. They were dying from diseases like malaria that are caused from mosquitoes. And the Native Americans, they didn't really die from malaria as much. They mostly died from smallpox. So Europeans were then faced with this problem of who can we find to work the land of the New World, and who's sort of going to be immune to maybe both of these sets of diseases. So that's the new problem that was facing the peoples of the New World. So yeah, mosquitoes, they're just the worst. Yeah, my sister, she's got malaria 3 times. She said it's just really, really bad. Okay, and now we bring up the concept of slavery. So slavery had existed for all of known history in Africa. And actually, really just about every culture in the world had slavery. Aztecs had slavery, Middle East had slavery, India had slavery. But slavery was a different thing in the old world. Slavery is going to become something unbelievably nasty in the new world. And Europeans found out that Africans had a good amount of immunity to smallpox and a good amount of immunity to malaria. Africans tend to have some of the strongest disease immune systems out of anyone around the world. So they became sort of the ideal worker, the ideal desired worker in this tropical new world, especially in the Caribbean islands that were going to be basically turned into these plantation agricultural zones. Um, yeah, Africa is going to get really terribly affected by these next steps that happen throughout world history. So, why Africans? Here's kind of a list that summarizes it all here. But the Europeans, they had the guns, and guns are going to be kind of the unfair element in all the kind of deals that get made here. So, yeah, let's check it out. Okay, and the idea of a race-based slave system, this was first done by Arabs in the Middle East, but then Europeans sort of saw how the Middle East was doing it, and they said, okay, we're going to do the same thing, and we're going to just make that happen in the New World. The New World, there obviously were no people of African descent there when Europeans showed up, so they sort of started to create these laws and these policies saying if you are of African descent in the New World, you are property. So something like that never really happened in the old world. Usually it was just people made slavery out of each other in their own ethnic groups, but now it has this whole racial element over here. And the first slave ships were sent to the New World, what is this, 502 years ago in the year 1518, and they started producing sugar cane in some of the tropical islands there. And so, how were Europeans actually getting slaves out of Africa? A really sad thing is there were many African kingdoms that were complicit in the slave trade. They desired these European guns, and they would typically kidnap people from other tribes or other regions of Africa, and they would the usual deal was they would trade a human life to get a European gun or maybe a big old box of ammo or gun cleaning equipment. Um, and it created this terrible process in Africa where they would trade away people for guns, and then they would use those guns to cause violence against other people. So it's this sort of cyclical cycle of destruction that would go on in Africa for probably the next. I mean, you could even argue it goes on through the 1800s, so really until the 1960s. Um, and Yeah, it's just really nasty how all these different African tribes were having this more or less continent-wide civil war where everyone's trying to get guns so they can sort of equalize themselves against their neighboring kingdoms, and the only way to get guns is to trade slaves to Europeans. So it was this never-ending process of terrible, terrible violence. So, yep, that's what it's all about, getting some of those early guns. And then it's, yeah, because if Europeans actually set foot on Africa during this time, they'd probably get killed by malaria, okay? Because Africa has a whole lot of those tropical climate diseases as well. So Europeans just sort of cleverly had these African middlemen who would find the slaves and then trade the slaves for guns. And then they would use the guns to massacre villages that didn't have gun weaponry. And then, yep, African guys with early guns bringing slaves to the coast. And to sort of better facilitate the transfer of slaves from Africa to the New World, a lot of these African kingdoms allowed Europeans to build slave ports along the coast. And these ports, a lot of them are actually still there today. These were built, 500 years ago, and like all I'm saying is I think these are kind of a symbol of a pretty terrible event that occurred in the past. I think these should get torn down. Um, yeah, so these slave ports, because along the coast there's a lot less interaction with mosquitoes, so Europeans were able to kind of comfortably make deals there. They didn't have to go too deep into Africa. And if you go back in time 500 years ago or more, you're going to see these ports just flooded with people. You're going to see ships on the outside, and this is kind of the transfer zone to take people out of Africa and send them to the New World. So, yeah, people say that slaves were taken from Africa. It's not true. People were taken from Africa and made into slaves. That is very true. I don't think anybody got on those ships willingly. And yep, there's the ports today. Until the lion has his historian, the hunter will always be the hero. That's pretty deep. And then, yep, you'll find these ports, especially all along where the African kingdoms were. And I think I can pretty confidently say the vast majority of Africans that will become slaves in the New World, almost all of them came from this part of Africa, talking about modern day Nigeria, Mali, Ghana, Togo. So this is kind of the prime place where slaves were sent to the New World. Okay, now we get into stuff that's really rough. So once slaves got put onto these ships, the ships would travel, of course, from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. And this part of the voyage is known collectively as the Middle Passage. And by all accounts, it was the worst way to show compassion or humanity to people in the history of the world. Slaves were treated as cargo. Slaves were not given any kind of acknowledgement or any kind of compassion in how they were transported to the New World. And I actually do have a document, which is the journal of one of these slave ship captains. You can actually read his own words. But I want to say there's something in there saying that if 25% of the slaves die along this voyage, that's like a good enough number for them. They expected that a huge percentage of people would not survive this voyage. Another fact that I know is that historians have studied shark patterns over the history of the world. They see where sharks have left their teeth along various beaches and stuff like that. And we found that while this Middle Passage was occurring, shark patterns in the Atlantic Ocean changed, where sharks from the North and South Atlantic kind of converged in the middle because they sort of expected that many people would be thrown over, dead bodies would be thrown over, And that's just that fact in itself shows you uh, the sheer numerical weight of how this slave trade affected our planet. Um, all right, so here's sort of a map of the slave trade. So, yes, most of the slaves came from this part of West Africa, but there were some from Central and then also from this part of Africa too. But the vast, vast majority of the slaves went to Brazil or the West Indies. Only 4% of all slave ships ever went to the United States of America. And that's why if you today go to countries like Haiti and Jamaica, you'll see many, many, many people of African descent. If you go to Brazil, it's definitely a more African or a higher percentage of people of African descent, and it's because these were the majority destinations from the slave trade. Yep, there's just kind of another picture showing the same thing. And then these are the various jobs they assigned slaves to do. But it looked like it was a whole lot of mining and then growing the crops tobacco, coffee, cotton, and sugar. And then, yep, this is a map of how they would put people in the slave ships. You see no room to even move around. They did pretty terrible things to female slaves. And here's another image of how they would stack people on some of these slave ships. It's terribly disturbing. And just treating them awfully, doing terrible, bad things. Okay, so over 14 million enslaved Africans were brought to the New World between 1500 and 1800. I think I even read somewhere that was probably 20% of all the people. Well, actually, hold on. 14 million were brought to the New World, but 20 million were put on slave ships. So 6 million died in transit. And I think there are some estimations that Africa only had about 100 million people back then. So we're talking about one out of every five Africans was enslaved during this period. And yeah, the triangle trade is the term used to collectively describe how the world trade functioned during this 300-year period. The pretty standard route of world trade was a ship would start in Europe. You would fill up the ship with guns, ammo, maybe alcohol, and you would sail your ship down to the African kingdoms areas. There you would dock at a slave port. You'd meet a member of the African kingdom's government. He would then, take your guns and your alcohol and what else you made in Europe, and he would fill up your ship full of captured people. You would then take those people to the New World. You would unload them, and from the New World, you'd load your ship up with gold, with coffee, with cotton, with all the natural raw resources, and then you'd take them back to Europe and you'd do the whole thing again. I do remember reading somewhere that a ship captain could do this sort of triangle voyage 10 times and retire a rich man. So this was the definite way to make money in the old world. Okay, there's the triangle trade right there. And then there's the people doing all the work. And Africa's getting people taken away from it. Yeah, and I think I mentioned this in one of my in that image before. But the vast, vast majority of slaves were sent to the Caribbean and Brazil. Very few ended up in this country. So yeah, here's just some more statistics about which country was the most responsible for the slave trade. It's pretty surprising that Portugal, they were sort of the leaders in making deals and taking slaves out of Africa. I mean, the United States only becomes sort of a thing later, but in the later years, it looks like the United States started to grow and grow, leading up to our Civil War. And then once our Civil War actually got going, we were one of the three countries that were still participating in the slave trade after a lot of other countries gave it up. All right. And then, yep, here's some pictures of slaves working in the conditions in the New World. So it's some pretty messed up stuff. Okay, and so there were racist beliefs held during this period that Africans were not human beings. There was a lot of difficulty, actually, with peoples of the New World who were so hardcore believers in Christianity. And in the Bible, there is stuff saying you cannot, have slaves and you got to set slaves free. But Europeans had this messed up way of interpreting things, saying that, well, they're not people. They're other creatures. They're other animals. And because of that, it sort of usurped the Christian morality. And people in this part of the world didn't really see them with any sort of compassion or humanity. Slaves were punished terribly if the owner felt that they weren't working effectively. And what's really messed up too is I know, historically speaking, I said that the Arab world also had race based slavery, but in the Arab world, there were a lot of laws saying things you cannot do to your slaves. You cannot remove them from their families. You cannot punish them to the point where you break their limbs or their legs or something like that. But in the New World, there were no laws. And in fact, in the New World, in the Americas, there were laws saying that if you helped a slave go free, you could become a slave yourself. You could be punished. You could be put in jail. So there were lots. There was way more of a pro-slavery stance in this part of the world than there was anywhere else in the world at any time in human history. I think I can confidently say, as a historian, there is no other period of history where people were treated as worse as Africans were than during the period of slavery within the continental Americas. So, yep, here's some people working on sugarcane. Here's some of the tools they would use to punish slaves, having slaves whip each other. Pretty terrible stuff. That one's really bad. And then, yeah, let me go ahead and read this. This is a newspaper article. To be sold on board the ship Blanche Laud on Tullafee of the 6th of May. A fine choice of 250 fine, healthy, Africans. Arrived from the windward Rice coast. The utmost care has been taken and shall be continued to keep them free of the danger of smallpox. See, so they already know smallpox. And this is an article from Charlestown, so that's in South Carolina. There's the effects of slavery beatings. People are whipping each other. It's pretty terrible stuff. Okay, so all of this money that's going to get generated by the work of slaves in the New World is obviously not going to benefit the slaves. They have no rights. They're sort of owned by their European overlords. And these Europeans who are utilizing the slave trade are going to send all this money back to Europe, and it's going to make the kings and queens of Europe incredibly wealthy. And I think I have heard the statement that the palaces of Europe were built on the backs of African laborers, and I think that's something I could definitely make a big argument for, because sort of the top tier of European royalty is going to get all kinds of money from this period, and they'll never ever really meet or interact with the people who are suffering and doing all of the hard work on their behalf. Okay, that's it for me. Peace out.